Hi, my name is Brandon, and I'm an alcoholic and addict in recovery. And I was talking to someone who's kind of early in their recovery journey today and realized that I've never made a video about how you know whether you have a problem with alcohol or drugs and need some help to resolve it. It's a question that a lot of people ask themselves, and the short answer to that question is if you find yourself asking that question, chances are you've got some kind of issue. You need to get some help to resolve or address it. But it's often a lot more complicated than that, and a lot of people don't like hearing that answer. They want something a little bit more definitive. So, what I have found out, and the person I was talking to, what they mentioned to me was that there are a lot of people who don't even like the idea of using the term alcoholic or addict in their description of people with problems. And so, we got to strip away all the labels, get past that, and say, what really are we talking about here? And when I think about alcoholism or having a drug problem, I think of a progressive, unhealthy relationship with that particular thing. So, for me, for example, I started drinking in college. I had what would be likely considered a normal relationship with alcohol for the peer group that I was hanging around with. As time progressed, my drinking became more frequent as their drinking became less frequent. As time progressed further, my drinking began to interfere with my life. I began to make choices that had negative impacts on my life and the life of those around me. And pretty soon, things like my performance at work were affected. I started having regrets associated with my use of alcohol and other drugs. I started to have financial problems associated with those things. And the reason I describe all of that isn't to say that you need to have all those things happen in order to be someone with a problem, but to describe a progression. As you see, I started out up here kind of normal, went down, and slowly started to see myself progress into a realm where not only did the alcohol and drugs interfere more and more with my day-to-day life and cause more and more problems with it, but they also became the centerpiece of my day-to-day life more and more. So I found myself having both obsessions and compulsions related to the use of these drugs, preparing for the use of these drugs. I mean, I think about it, for example, I used to get so excited to go to the liquor store. You know, it was so much fun. And think about, for those of you watching this who are in recovery, think about how you feel now when you go to the grocery store to buy things you need. Do you get excited like it's like Christmas morning? Because that's how I used to feel going to the liquor store. So I even got a high just from preparing to get my drugs. That's an indication that you've got a progressive problem, a progressive unhealthy relationship occurring with alcohol and or the drugs you're using. There's a lot of classic symptoms. Increase time spent either using or preparing to use or recovering from the use of these drugs. Increased interference in your life, and getting in trouble with the law, isolating from your family. The list goes on, and you can find substantial lists anywhere online about, what are the things that help me understand whether or not I've got a problem. But if I had to sum it up, that's the way I would do it. I would say it's a defined by a progressive unhealthy relationship. You're just continuing to get worse and worse as time goes on. Now, here's the important thing to know. For some people, this happens slowly. For some people, it happens very quickly. So you can't define yourself in your own relationship with drugs and alcohol by what you see in other people. What I used to always tell myself is, well, I don't have a problem because I haven't had a DUI. I haven't been in jail. I haven't ever done something too violent to anybody. All these things I could list out that I would hear about other people. I've never lost my house. I've never been homeless. All these things I could list out that I could give myself reasons and say, see, I'm not as bad as that person, so I don't have their problem. But that's not an appropriate way to look at it. You got to look at your relationship with the alcohol or drugs and what it is doing in your life. And that's why I like the definition of this progressive unhealthy relationship. And look at your relationship with drugs and alcohol and figure out, is it maintaining? Like, are you the kind of person who over the last 10 years you've just reliably gone through a 12 pack of beer every week? And some days you drink and some days you don't, and you really don't have a schedule to it. And there's been a couple times where you've had a little bit too much and maybe driven when you shouldn't have. At that point, looking at just hearing that, maybe you don't have a problem. Maybe you don't have an unhealthy relationship with alcohol. That being said, if you see yourself in a position where, about 10 years ago, you were drinking a little bit each day, and then all of a sudden, about 5 years ago, you started getting drunk a few times a week, and now you're at a point where you're getting drunk every night. That's a progression. And so that's what we really want to pay attention to, is change over time. And if you're seeing that relationship change over time, then that's an indication you've got an unhealthy relationship with that object. Okay? It's the same thing with food. So this is really important for me. I know for a fact I have an unhealthy relationship with food. And here's why. Because I can watch my relationship with food change over time. And when I'm really stressed out, I eat poorly. When I'm feeling good and everything's going well, I find it easier to stay on track. And you might be hearing that and saying, well, that's normal. That happens to everybody. And I would argue, not necessarily. I have plenty of friends who eat healthfully, regardless of whether they're stressed, regardless of what's going on. They may eat a meal here or there out of convenience that's not the healthiest for them. They may, as celebration, have a piece of cake here or there or something like that, and not go too far outside of their diet. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about gorging on a pint of ice cream. I'm talking about, eating in a way that is definitely against what I would prefer to be doing for the diet that I'd like to do. And you have to look at drugs and alcohol the same way. Do you have a relationship with drugs and alcohol where you are slowly seeing things become unhealthy over time? Or do you have a relationship where it feels more take or leave, And the last example that I'm going to give is, think about what would happen if tomorrow all the alcohol and drugs that you have in your life disappeared, like some alien force came down from the sky and just boop, they teleported all the booze and drugs out of the earth, and because they were going to a really killer party. What would your reaction be? People who don't have issues with drugs or alcohol might register some disappointment at that event, But if you find yourself feeling any amount of anxiety or fear related to that idea, or to make it more realistic, think about if you went to the doctor tomorrow and the doctor told you, you're pretty healthy otherwise, except you have got to stop drinking, for example, and you can't drink for the rest of your life. If you get a feeling of anxiety and fear at the prospect of not being able to drink the rest of your life, that's an indication of this unhealthy relationship. And I would encourage you to look back and see, has your relationship had a progression where you have engaged more and more in not only consuming alcohol, but in unhealthy behaviors related to that? Those are the kind of things you have to look at. So, at the end of this 10-minute video, I can give you the simplest answer is that if you find yourself wondering whether you have a problem, there's a good chance you do. That's just the fact, because most people who don't have a problem with alcohol or drugs don't sit around wondering whether they have problems with alcohol or drugs. They're pretty confident that they can take it or leave it, and it's just not a centerpiece in their life the way it is for the rest of us. And that's when you got to start looking at, well, what about this progression? What am I seeing there? So, lots more to discuss, but I'm very curious as to your thoughts. In the meantime, I'll be back here tomorrow with more.